Hi guys, my name is Kirsty. Welcome back to Upside Down Books.
Non più tra i farfalloni amorò.
Today is the first day of December and I am so excited about it. But we're going to be taking a look back on November and having a look at what books I got around to reading. I went into November with pretty high hopes of how many books I'd get around to or what books I'd get around to. I had a nice quaint TBR set up, but I had a bit of a curveball in the month with one book that tied me up for 3 weeks. So, yeah. That being said though, considering this one book took me 3 weeks to read, I still managed to get around to 5 books in November and I'm pretty chuffed with that. I feel like that's not a bad effort considering how much reading I had to get done in between all of that. So my TBR, which I set up over on Instagram, so if you don't follow me there, my handle is OzBooks now. Feel free to go give me a follow to see future updates because I do post TBRs on Instagram. It's the only place I really ever do it. But I wanted to read Morningstar, Salvation Lost, The Harp of Kings or The King's Harp, I can't remember what it's called, and Serpent and Dove. And I didn't get around to all of them, but I did actually get around to a few. Currently at the moment I'm still reading Morningstar. I'm about halfway through as I'm filming this. I really wanted to get this finished before December because today I am starting a readathon that is going for most of the month. But I don't want to put this one down and give up on it before the year is out, so I'm still going to just try and finish reading this one off, but I was really enjoying it. I just didn't have enough time at the end of the month to actually finish it. And I've been powering through audiobooks. My current audiobook is The Name of All Things, which is the sequel to The Ruin of Kings, which is the new fantasy series that came out at the start of this year, if you're not familiar with it. And a lot of people have been really struggling their way through the book one because it is such like a heavy read that takes a whole lot of thinking to get through it. And book two so far is quite similar, but it's very interesting reading the audiobook versus the physical book. However, because it is a bit heavier and it's a bit longer, I didn't get through that one, but that's not really any stress. So let's have a look at the books I did get around to. The first book that I finished in November was actually an audiobook, and that was The Fry Chronicles by Stephen Fry. This was incredible. I ended up rating it 5 out of 5 stars. I think that I actually rated it more than I rated his first memoirs. So Stephen Fry has 3 memoirs out currently. He's got Moab is My Washpot, The Fry Chronicles, and More Fool Me. So this was really good. He has so much to talk about and such an interesting life that it's such a fun book to just get lost in and hear about all the stupid things he got up to, what it was like going from his beginnings to his fame and his career later on in life. He's such a fascinating person that if you've ever seen any of his stuff or you're just mildly interested in him, his memoirs are so entertaining to read. I couldn't recommend them enough. I flew through these. I didn't want to stop listening. I didn't want to put it down. And his audiobooks, the memoirs, are narrated by him and he's a very good narrator. So would highly recommend exploring these via audiobook. I did read the first one in its physical format and I do think that reading it via audiobook for the second book was better. The next book that I got around to reading was Throne of Glass by Sarah J Maas. This is a reread. Don't worry, I'm not just starting this series for the first time, but I've been meaning to get a move on with this reread for such a long time. Last year or earlier this year, I can't remember when it was, I read The Assassin's Blade, which is the prequels, the bind up of all the prequels, and I've just not sort of found the time or the motivation, I suppose, to pick up Throne of Glass, but I finally did and it took me a matter of days to get through this. You just forget how good the story is. I'm so hesitant to reread a book that I read, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago that I read this the first time, and you're just so worried it's going to tarnish your memory of it. It's like rereading Harry Potter. It's terrifying, but it's just like Harry Potter in that it never lets you down, and it was so good to re-explore all these characters and remember why you loved it so much and why you shipped people. And interestingly, I always used to ship Selena and Dorian, but in this reread I actually am feeling the vibe for Chaol and I'm understanding Team Chaol for the first time in my life. So having that as my mindset with book one, I'm curious to see if that changes how I view the rest of the series, and I can't wait to keep reading it. But I have been really tied down with ARCs, and the book that tied me up in November stopped me from getting around to Crown of Midnight, and I probably won't get around to it in December either because I'm doing a readathon up until the 25th. But I can't wait to continue it. I rated this one 5 out of 5 stars, and my full review is up on my blog. I have re-reviewed it as well, so if you want to hear my thoughts on what it's like rereading Throne of Glass, then you can head over there. The next book I rated 4 out of 5 stars, and that was Stalking Jack the Ripper, and this was like a really good surprise. I wasn't expecting it to be bad, but I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did. There was one other book I read earlier this year, Jane Steele, which I was as surprised with, which a lot of people have read. There's not like an immense amount of hype over it. People aren't still going crazy raving over them, but I was like, books on my backlog that I just wanted to get around to, and Stalking Jack the Ripper has been one of these books for ages. I have been meaning to read it via audiobook for a good year. It's been on my wish list for ages, but it's not even quite 10 hours, or maybe it's 12. It's quite short, and I just never felt like I was getting value for money. When you're reading 60-hour Outlander books and you're paying the same, but for 10 hours, it just kind of is like, should I spend my Audible credit on such a small book? But I finally bit the bullet, and I did, and I just really enjoyed it. It was such a good mystery. I really liked all the characters. I thought it was really cool the way it was set out. I love having an independent and fierce woman in an older time period where that's not appropriate, and she does something that's just awesome and stands up for herself and really challenges those social constructs. So this was really interesting, especially given that it's all about Jack the Ripper, and I've never really read up on Jack the Ripper. I think I just have a general knowledge of what he did, so I wasn't really sure what to expect with a whole book about him, but I thought it was really interesting. It had some really good plot twists, and I loved the relationship in this book as well. What I wasn't expecting was that the sequels, so I think it is Hunting Prince Dracula and something Houdini, I can't remember what they're called, the same characters. I'm not sure about the Houdini one, but I assume so, because I thought we would have the same sort of world that was maybe linked up loosely with characters, but because they are so different, this one is set in England and Hunting Prince Dracula is set in Romania, I assumed we would have a different cast, but no. The author has done a really clever job of linking it all together and having a reason for our characters to now be in another country. So I can't wait to move on with this series and see what happens next, and I will more than likely continue this via audiobook. I really liked the narrator for this one. So that brings me to the book that threw a spanner in my works. I ended up rating this 3.5 out of 5 stars. And that book is Salvation Lost by Peter F. Hamilton. If you've been following me over the last few months of this year, then you'll know that I have been endeavouring to get through this series because Pam McMillan was very kind to send me book 1. This is book 2. Left my bookmark in there. Pam McMillan sent me book 1 so that I could read that and catch up and then read and review this one. This series is really fascinating, and both Jaden and I have really been enjoying this. I think Jaden has maybe been enjoying it slightly more than I've been. This is a hard sci-fi, and hard sci-fi always takes me a while to read. It's not usually my genre. Hard sci-fi is basically a step up from just your normal sci-fi, and it is really into all the science and physics behind stuff and some very sort of cool and original ideas. My favourite hard sci-fi book so far has been The Forever War, and I really liked how clever that book was. And this one isn't so much a clever book, but a very interesting book. So it took me a while to read because Hamilton, he's very wordy. He uses a lot of descriptions to explain the science and how things are working. And there's a lot of backstories into these books. So this book is definitely not for everyone, but I will absolutely be reading the third and final. I assume the third book will be the final book in this series. Now this book does not look long. I was sent a very tall edition of this, but the standard normal size book is actually 900 pages long. So I didn't realize when I was reading this, because this is nearly 500 pages like this, that it was such a big book. The first one was about 650 pages, so this is honestly quite a commitment. But I do have my full review for this up over on my blog if you want to go and read some further thoughts. If you've read book 1, or if you want to read my review of book 1, because my review for this does contain spoilers for the sequel. But overall, this is a really interesting alien invasion story, and it's really fun. You really like the characters as you go through, so the backstories are a real treat. But it just sort of takes a while to get anywhere, and this was very, 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 very slow moving at the beginning, and you're just sort of like, okay, we get it, go and do something now. So I did enjoy this. It was so frustrating that it took me 3 weeks to read when I was in such a good reading mood. Probably was a great thing that I was in a good reading mood, or I could have got really stuck on this. But in any case, thank you Pam McMillan for sending me a copy of this to review. I told a lie. I thought I read 5 books in November, but I actually only read 4, so that actually brings me to the end of my wrap up for today. Let me know down in the comments below if you have read any of these books, if you're planning on reading any of them. I would love to hear your thoughts, but other than that, I will see you in my next video. Goodbye.